I'm Pastor Chris, and this is Pastor's Corner, where we, as pastors of Lincroft Bible Church, have discussions and teach the Bible to help you follow Jesus. And today, church, we have a special conversation, particularly for those of you who are leaders. We're recapping our leadership summit that we typically have once or twice a year. And we've had a couple different sessions at this leadership summit, and one of the sessions is talking about LBC in something called the gray zone. And so this is an important conversation. Pastor Dennis led that session, and we're going to talk about what the gray zone is and what it means that LBC is in the gray zone. And so Dennis, in his book, A Non-Anxious Presence, author Mark Sayers, he describes this gray zone. And he says the gray zone is a time of transition. It's a time where two eras kind of overlap each other. Yeah. There's an old one that's fading, a new one that's emerging, but it hasn't been quite established yet. And so it can be a confusing, disorienting time, but also lay the groundwork for renewal. And so why is understanding that LBC is in a gray zone important for our leaders to know?
Yeah, I think the simple answer is when you understand where you are, it just helps to relieve the anxiety and the uncertainty, and as you said, and I think that's the right word, the disorientation that's in it. Because the definition of the gray zone that Mark Sayers uses is it's a time that contains elements of what's old, so things can still feel kind of familiar and comfortable to you. It can contain things of the era that's coming, which is new and sometimes exciting, sometimes uncertain, and it can contain a mix of those things and things that aren't both. They're just transitional. And so it can be a very disorienting time. But when you step back and you understand, oh, this is why this is happening, it just helps to relieve the stress, it helps to relieve the anxiety, and just helps you to kind of rest in the fact that, okay, this is where we are. I don't know how long we're going to be here, but I understand it. And so I think that's an important element. And as I shared when we met in the all leaders meeting, is as I look back over my history here at LBC, going back to the late 1980s, I can now see so many of those transitions that have happened, probably 6, 8, 10, maybe a dozen different transitions. It would have been so helpful to be able to see it in that context, because it just helps, like I said, just to relieve the anxiety. Because when you understand something, the fear tends to dissipate in it. And so I think that's hugely important. The other thing that I think is so important about understanding that you're in a gray zone, it helps you to prepare better, right? Because I understand where we came from. That was the era that we all were in. And so we understand those elements and why they're there and how to operate in that. But we don't quite know where we're going. But knowing that I'm in a transition time helps us all to have conversations about, well, what will it look like when we get there? And to make good decisions, to be intentional about some things that you do now that helps you to prepare and to get to the place that you want to be, rather than just allowing circumstances to control you. And so there's an intentionality that comes from understanding where you are in the gray zone. And the example that I would use is, so people may be looking on a Sunday morning and seeing things that are different, right, about it. And one of the things that I think have been noticeable is the fact that I'm less visible on a Sunday morning. You can look at sort of the preaching of the church. It's still me, you, and Dan doing it, but the amounts have changed. I think I preach on average maybe every 6 or 7 weeks. So basically it's you and Dan splitting the pulpit for the most part, and I'm filling in on an irregular kind of basis. That's a change that we intentionally made back in 2019 in preparation for where we think we're going in another 3 years or so. So that's just a good example of, one, understanding that's why this is here. We're in a gray zone and there's things changing. And two, it's a good example of being intentional about where you're going and making changes now to help you move in a good direction. And so both of those things, the idea of I understand where I am And the idea of being able to prepare and be intentional about things that are changing just takes what is normally a period of instability and it brings stability into it. So you can relax. As I said, the anxiety can dissipate, some of the fears can dissipate, and you can just make good decisions in it. It becomes a much more stable time for you. And so that's why I think it's so important. And it's been so helpful for me, in reading Mark Sayers, just to have that sort of framework
Yeah.
to process all of this.
So one of the things that you mentioned in there was how it's affecting your present, it dissipates the anxiety, and then also affects your future, how it can help you make better decisions because you're actually preparing
Right.
for the transition that's coming. But I think there was also elements in there of, you look back at the past and you saw this reoccurring pattern of many transitions or many gray zones in the life of LBC over the years. And so, thinking about those past ones up until today, like where have you seen the gray zone impacting LBC right now?
Well, I think the obvious one right now, well, one example was just the Sunday morning service and the changes that are happening there. But I think one that's really been just present with us over the last couple of months is just the financial situation of the church, right? Because one of the characteristics of this current gray zone that we're in is a changing demographic within the church. And what's come along with that changing demographic, and there's a lot of factors in it more than just demographics, has been just change in the giving patterns of the church. And so when we set out this fiscal year, which began on April 1st, we put a budget in place for a $750,000 income. That was kind of our projected income. When we got to June, June was really an off month, probably the lowest giving month in well over a decade, as far as I can remember. When we hit that month, July, as elders, we spent a lot of time just trying, one, to understand what's going on, and two, to begin to think about what does this mean. Mm-hmm. And so we began to prepare for, okay, it's not $750,000. It looked like projections going forward were probably going to be closer to $670,000, right? It's a characteristic of the gray zone. Things are changing, and they're changing in that way. Financially, things are changing. So it's allowing us to see it in the light and to make some decisions now to help us to move forward. And so we've made, and we shared this at the informational meeting back in August, and also at the All Leaders meeting. So we've made changes to our expenses, basically adjustments to the budget, and it's been four main areas. We've suspended our contributions to the E-Free, which they're fine with. We have stopped self-funding our building maintenance fund, which is sort of a rainy day fund for when things break that are costly. We've made adjustments to the salaries pretty much across the board, and we've made adjustments to our missions budget. I think we reduced it by about 20%, which will take effect on October 1. All of that combines to put us more on a trajectory where, okay, we're getting closer to a $670,000 budget. So that's great. It allows us to adjust now. But what it also enables us to do is over the next 4 months, as we end 2022 and begin 2023, which puts us in the budget setting season for next year, we can begin to look at, okay, are we a $750,000 a year church, or are we a $650,000, or what are we? And to begin to prepare for changes that will result from a difference in the church. And so that financial picture is one clear area where we are seeing things change, heading into a new era, and it's allowing us now. And the title of his book is A Non-Anxious Presence. It allows us to be non-anxious as leaders, to lead through this uncertainty. It's really like God is in control of all of this. Let's begin to talk and to think and to pray and to prepare for what's coming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think about with the finances, one question that I think a lot of people in the church have had as well, what's caused this, right? We had the big dip in June,
Right.
and just some giving across the board has been down, and there's obviously a lot of factors. It's hard to pin it down on one, but I think, one that we've talked a lot about is just the changing
Yes.
demographics of the church.
Mhm.
And so, given the fact of what the last 2 years have been, we have seen some very well established families who had probably been large financial contributors that they've moved out of state. We know New Jersey's very expensive to live, and they may have retired or have family out of state and they move there. It's cheaper to live. And even though we've seen our attendance stabilize, and it's actually seems to be growing a bit in terms of Sunday morning attendance, we have largely been filling that hole in a sense with college students who have no money and younger families, which may not, again, have as much, or they may be newer to the church. And it usually takes some time before you're really bought into the mission and
Mhm.
vision of a place to really begin giving. So I think we've seen some of these dynamics and the changing demographics is definitely one of those gray zone things to
Right.
be looking out for. I think another thing that you mentioned in there was just, the budget is impacting staffing.
Mhm.
And so what does that mean in your mind in terms of big picture and how the gray zone impacts our staffing and our structure?
Well, again, you're in a gray zone, so we're going somewhere, right? We may not know fully where that will be, or I think also what's critical is we may not know the timing of getting to whatever that new thing is, but we know new is coming, right? And we can see pieces of this. And so we've been having conversations going back all the way to 2019, I think, as I think back on it, about, well, what does it look like when we get 3 years out from this, so say 2025, although you can't really lay hard lines down that. What is it going to look like in 2025 in terms of our staff? And so what we've been talking about is what it will probably look like, and you hold these things loosely, but what will probably look like is we're not going to change sort of the constitutional structure of the church, right? That's just the way it is. We're congregationally led with an elder board that has, authority over the spiritual life of the church and all of those things so that's not going to change. So sitting sort of over the whole thing is the congregation and the elders. But we have what we've been calling an executive team, which is really the pastoral staff of the church. And so it's been me, you, and Dan have sort of filled that box. And then it was ministries underneath it and sort of been ad hoc. We each take different areas of responsibility, but it's sort of been ad hoc. But what this gray zone has enabled us to do, particularly as me, you, and Dan, as we talk about this, is to begin to sort of structure what it looks like underneath. And so the executive box, as we look forward a number of years, will be you and Dan, right? So that's the executive team. And under it, what we've been talking about is let's call it departments. We have these 6 buckets, areas of ministry that we see the church falling into. You can help me out when I miss what those boxes are. But basically, we have the Sunday morning, the worship piece, which is huge. That's one box. We have what we're calling next generation. That's going to be things like youth and family ministries, that kind of thing. We have college ministry, which isn't typical for all churches, but given where we are and our history with college right across the street, that is for us a major area of ministry. So we're considering that a bucket of its own. And so we have Sunday morning, we have next generation, we have college, we have general operations, which is sort of just we have a building, we have land, we have stuff that goes on. So we have an operations, which is facility finance and things like that. We have outreach, which would include our missions committee, and then all the local outreach that we try to do in that. And then the last piece is
Adults?
adults. Yes, we have adults ministry. I almost got
Yeah.
through the whole thing. And then we have adults ministry. So we have these 6 departments that we're looking at, and an executive team. And what we've kind of been coming down to is that in between that is a director level piece, which means you'll have someone who has responsibility and oversight for each of these areas. And in an ideal world where we have unlimited budgets, that would be a paid staff person in each. And that would give you, I think, the best oversight and the most focus on each of these areas so that they can flourish as much as possible. The reality is we don't live in an ideal world with unlimited budgets. So the question now, and kind of a long answer, but the question now as we look forward is how do we fill the director levels? Given, are we a $750,000 church or are we a $650,000 church? We have our executive team, which probably will be you and Dan. We have these buckets that define what we do as a church. How do we do the oversight to it? And there's kind of three answers to that. One is one of the executive team will oversee it. So, for example, your Sunday morning, you're in that bucket. You have a team around you for leadership, but you're in that. Dan is college, right? So one answer is the executive team will fill the director level. Two is volunteer. We'll have a volunteer in those positions or volunteers in those positions. And the third one would be staff. You hire someone. And so as we look forward, given that structure, which ones can we afford to fill with staff? Which ones need to be filled with staff? And it just enables us to think clearly about where are we going and what's the best path to it. And so that's how I view our staffing situation and our trajectory forward, is thinking in terms of these director levels and what's the best way to do that given everything else in the gray zone.
Right. And I think what we've come to realize too is, there's nothing necessarily special about this structure.
No, it's not.
It's really just, it's almost what almost every church needs to do.
Mm-hmm.
You worship God together, so you're going to have stuff going on Sunday morning. If you're having young families, you're going to need stuff for kids and youth. And then again, the unique piece of where we're situated is we do have college, but still, like, you have to disciple adults, you want to reach out into the community, and if you have a building, you just have operations. So to a certain degree, it's just a matter of getting clear on paper, like, what do we have to cover?
Right.
What do we need to see? How do we keep things from slipping through the cracks? And then how do we think creatively about doing these things? Because we just don't want to neglect, a vital area of ministry. So we want to just think creatively about that.
Again, going back to your earlier question, it enables us, knowing where we are, this gray zone framework or lens through which we can say, just enables us to be intentional about these things because they're real, they're happening, and it's just a good way to move forward and ask good questions and to take logical steps towards some goal that you're trying to meet.
Mm-hmm. So based on this discussion, we're in the gray zone as a church. We're in a place of transition. It can be confusing, but we have also noticed that it can be places of renewal.
Yep.
And so I think we've seen renewal in bringing newer people to the body. We've seen people who've been here for a while really stepping up, taking their faith seriously, taking ownership of new avenues of ministry. So how should the leaders who are listening to this, how should they respond to us being in the gray zone?
Well, I think one way to respond is to take to heart this idea of non-anxious presence, to really think and pray about this time of change and to ask the Lord to fill you with that sort of calm about where we're going, because He knows exactly where He's taking us. And so the first thing is be a non-anxious leader by processing, well, what does this mean for your ministry? What am I seeing in the church, and how can I identify what's old, what's new, what's changed, kind of a thing. So really process that, and don't be afraid to ask questions. Right? If you're seeing something that you don't understand, whether it's for the church at large or in particular for your ministry, ask. Just ask. This is a time for questions, a time for conversation, a time to share and collaborate on ideas about where the whole is going and where the different pieces are going. And the other thing is to just think of your ministry in terms of a gray area. What does it mean? If the church is in a gray area, is my ministry also in a gray area? The answer is probably yes to some degree. And to begin to identify, well, what's old, what's new, what do I need to let go of, what do I need to grab hold of, and what do I need to be intentional about as I move forward?
Yeah, that's really helpful. That's really helpful. So, church, I hope that this was a helpful conversation for you to overhear, for you to be a part of. Again, we want you to be a part of this. So if you have questions about anything that was mentioned in this video, whether it's budget or staffing or what the gray zone is or any of that, we would love to continue with that. Reach out to us. We love you. We thank you for all of your service and all of the ministry that you've been doing, and we look forward to laboring with you this year.